Um, there we go. Yeah, that's working. Okay, my name is Nir Zakovich, and I am the director of the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston. And Professor Talisse's talk is sponsored by the Philosophy Department and by the Ethics Center. And Professor Bob Talisse is the Elton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt. He works on contemporary political philosophy with an interest in democratic theory and political epistemology, and he also pursues topics in pragmatism, analytic philosophy, argumentation theory, and ancient philosophy. Very prolific scholar. Some of his recent books are Overdoing Democracy, Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place from 2019, Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy with Scott Eichen in 2018, and Engaging Political Philosophy from 2016. Bob's talk today is Why We Need Political Enemies. Bob, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you, and the mic is yours.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and for making time for the talk. I'm going to share my screen, and the first thing to note is that I'm giving a different talk from the one I advertised. So this talk is, it will deal with some of the same themes as the political enemies talk, but this talk is called The Problem of Polarization. And you know, I've been working on the various phenomena that are called polarization for a while. And in some recent work, I've proposed two theses that people have told me are counterintuitive. In the 2019 book, Overdoing Democracy, I argued that in order to address polarization, citizens have a civic responsibility to engage with others in non-political cooperative activities. And in the new book, which just came out earlier this month, which is titled Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe to the Other Side, both with Oxford, I argue that in order to address polarization, citizens also need to sometimes engage in political activities all by themselves, that is, without allies or enemies onlooking. Now, today's talk isn't going to focus directly on either of these claims. Instead, I'm going to talk about the problem that polarization poses for democracy. There's a lot of talk, even among pundits and popular commentators, about the badness of polarization, and the president in his inaugural speech lamented how divided we are and said we need to unify. There's not a whole lot of talk, at least in the popular discourse and even in academic circles, about what polarization is and why it's problematic. So we need some clarification, it seems to me. So let's look at today's agenda. Why isn't this advancing? There it is. So I want to move in 4 steps. First, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by democracy. Then I want to separate out 2 different phenomena that are both rightly called polarization, but are importantly distinct, what I'll call political polarization and then belief polarization. Third, I want to present an account of how these 2 types of polarization, once they're disambiguated, interact in particular ways, and that may, in a way that is the problem for democracy. That is, I want to identify the problem of polarization with the interaction between 2 different phenomena that are called polarization. And then finally, I want to say a couple of quick things about managing polarization. But first, we need to talk about what democracy is anyway. Now, when we think about democracy, our minds quickly fix on certain institutional and practical issues or matters like elections and voting and campaigns, debates, pollsters, lobbyists, these sorts of things. It's very hard to make sense of why any of those instrumental and practical manifestations of democracy should play such a central role in our thinking of what democracy is, unless we see them as in the service of an underlying ideal. And I want to contend that democracy is an ideal. What's the ideal? Well, it's the ideal of self-government among political equals. In a democracy, we are equals with respect to our governing institutions and those who occupy offices, official offices within those institutions. And so we are equals with respect to our government. We might think of that as a vertical axis of our political equality. And part of what that means is that we each, as citizens of a self-governing community, have a responsibility or have the obligation to take responsibility for our politics. This means that we are, as democratic citizens, under the obligation to participate, to be active, to not merely be passive, to play a role in authoring our share or doing our share to author the political world around us. In this way, democracy is a dignifying image of us as people. It says that a relatively just, stable social order is possible, even in the absence of rulers and kings and lords and royals and those sorts of things. But that's not all that there is to the democratic ideal. If the democratic ideal is self-government among equals, not only are we equals with respect to our governing institutions, so not only does equality, not only is equality to be understood along that vertical dimension, in a democracy, we are also one another's equals. That is, we have a responsibility to one another. That is, we have to recognize as democratic citizens that none among us is another's boss or overlord or subordinate or lackey. That is, we owe to one another a certain degree of regard. No citizen just gets to call the shots for everybody else. And we don't get to boss one another around. And I'll even go so far as to say that one of the hard truths of democracy, one of the hard moral truths of democracy, is that knowing what's right, or knowing what justice requires, or knowing what's best in a democratic society does not entitle you to get your way or to push anybody around. And similarly, in a democracy, having flawed ideas within a broad spectrum, having flawed ideas about what justice requires or what's best or what the government should be doing, doesn't mean you don't get a say in determining what government should be doing. Now, there's a lot to be said about what it is to regard one another as equals and what that regard requires that we can get into in the Q&A if you like. I'm just going to move on. Now, self-government among people who regard one another as equals is not going to be easy, because one of the upshots of political equality is that, for better or worse, political equals get to make up their own minds about political questions. Again, within a broad spectrum, we get to make up our own minds. We're not required as an obligation of citizenship to defer or to shut up or to let somebody else decide for us when it comes to even important political questions. Now, given that given that an upshot of our political equality is that we get to make up our own minds, a self-governing society of equals who regard one another as equals is also going to be a self-governing society of people who disagree, sometimes pretty severely. I don't know why this is not advancing. Sorry. Disagree pretty severely about political questions. And they're going to disagree sometimes pretty severely, even about justice. So therefore, we might say the democratic ideal issues a challenge of a moral kind to us as democratic citizens. And I want to just suggest to you that it's a difficult challenge. the challenge is to regard your fellow citizens as your equals, therefore, as entitled to an equal say. Not merely our fellow citizens don't merely get an equal say, they're entitled to one. We have to regard our fellow citizens as our equals, even when we see their political judgment as profoundly misguided, their political values as profoundly distorted, their political ideas as uninformed, ignorant, mistaken in all kinds of ways. That is, the challenge that democracy issues to us as citizens is to uphold a certain moral stance towards our fellow citizens, even when we assess them as on the side of injustice within a certain broad range, even when we assess them as not merely on the wrong side of the political questions that we face as a community, but in the wrong, given their exercise of political judgment. So that's never easy. You can read a lot of democratic theory that I think downplays this fundamental moral challenge at the heart of democratic citizenship. You can read a lot of democratic theory that downplays which is what I see as a intrinsically conflicted moral stance that is required of the democratic citizen. Now, none of that is to disparage democracy. It's just to say, well, let's make sure that we're getting an accurate picture of what we're committing to. In a democratic society, we're committing to the moral proposition that there will be some people who are advocates of injustice, who are nonetheless entitled to an equal say in determining the shape and the contours of our political world. And when they prevail, despite the fact that their policy views, their aims about, or their ideas about what government should be doing, despite the fact that they're mistaken about all of those things, they get their way in a duly democratic process, it would be wrong for the government not to enact their will. Okay. Now, all of that I want to suggest is very, very difficult. It's a strained moral position, and polarization makes it harder. Now, when people talk about polarization, they're often talking about one of these two things. The first, what I'm going to call political polarization. Political polarization is familiar, I think, and this is the familiar dominant sense of the term. It's a metric of what we might think of as the ideological or doctrinal distance between two opposed groups. In this case, since we're talking about the US, we might just say parties. So a society is heavily politically polarized when the two dominant political units, in this case parties, have pulled towards their ideological extremes and therefore allowed the middle ground between them to go unoccupied. And the thing about middle ground, especially in moral and political debate, is when it's unoccupied, it becomes barren and it falls away, it dissolves. And so political polarization is a condition where the dominant parties and the members of dominant parties are so far apart that there's no middle ground where they could productively communicate, cooperate, compromise, and even engage in the act of governing. Now, extreme political polarization is a problem for democracy, maybe not as such, but when it's extreme, it's a problem for democracy because it creates log jams and deadlocks and paralysis, along with a whole lot of resentment and cross-partisan animosity, so on and so forth. We could talk more about the different ways of measuring that distance between parties and different ideas about how to determine whether any particular society, including our own, is profoundly politically polarized in the Q&A if you like. But I want to suggest that in order to make good sense of the problem that political polarization poses for democracy, we actually need to look at a different phenomenon that's also called polarization. What I'm calling belief polarization, although it's sometimes called group polarization, even though I think the term group polarization is misleading. Now, whereas political polarization is the metric of the distance between two groups, like what's going on in the graphic there, Belief polarization is different. It's not a metric of the distance between two groups. It's a phenomenon that occurs within a single group. Roughly speaking, belief polarization is a cognitive phenomenon that occurs within like-minded groups. More specifically, it's the regularity with which interaction among like-minded people turns them into more extreme versions of themselves. When we interact only or mainly or centrally with people who believe the things that we do, we come to hold more extreme versions of those common commitments. Now, what I mean by more extreme there requires a little philosophical nuance, and I'll just give the quick formula. You can ask about it in Q&A if you like. We become more extreme in that we adopt more extreme contents of our political beliefs. We come to hold those more extreme contents with higher degrees of confidence than the degree of confidence with which we held their antecedents. And we come to adopt a more fervent level of commitment to our epistemic perspective or our stance. We become, when we're belief polarized, we become more ardently feminist or environmentalist or conservative. That is, our sense of the political identity from which our political beliefs issue, our sense of the righteousness and correctness of that identity escalates as well. So we can get into the details again. There's roughly 3 kinds of intensification that work together that go along with belief polarization. Now, having said that, I should mention, this is an uncommonly robust social scientific finding. It's hard to find one that's been more widely documented and more thoroughly studied. We have data from around the world that goes back for at least 60 years. The phenomenon of belief polarization doesn't seem to vary according to any of the demographic factors that you think it might. It doesn't seem to vary significantly with education, gender identity, ethnicity, geography, economic status, educational level, religious conviction, so on and so forth. It's pretty robust across all of those demographic differences. It's found in groups of all kinds. It doesn't apply only to groups that are like-minded with respect to some political or moral belief. In fact, it doesn't seem to track anything like what we philosophers like to think of as the fact-value distinction. Like-minded groups that are unified in a banal, empirical, merely descriptive claim, polarized just as groups that are unified around some evaluative claim. So if you get a bunch of people together, all of whom agree that Denver, Colorado is notably high among American cities above sea level, and you get them talking about the elevation of Denver, Colorado, they tend to leave the interaction with the sense that Denver is higher above sea level than they thought it was before they began interacting. That doesn't look evaluative, that's just a banal empirical fact about the world. So it doesn't only attach to normative or evaluative or beliefs that are assessing anything. It doesn't seem to vary with respect to the purposes of the like-minded group. That is, if the group is interacting for the purpose of deciding some collective judgment, or if the group is interacting for the purpose of engaging in some collective action, or if the group is interacting for no particular purpose at all. The phenomenon doesn't vary across any of those scenarios in any significant way. Moreover, in belief polarization, groups that are composed of moderates with respect to the like-minded commitment shift no less quickly or extremely than groups that have some extremists within them. So the phenomenon, therefore, doesn't seem like it's a case of some loudmouth extremist browbeating and coercing with rhetoric people into a more extreme view. You get a bunch of moderates together and they shift roughly in the ways that you would expect, even if they had extremists. Finally, belief polarization seems to walk hand in hand with a phenomenon called the risky shift phenomenon. That is, as groups belief polarize, not only do members of the group come to intensify their attitudes in the direction of extremity in the ways I've just been discussing, group members become more tolerant of risky behavior on behalf of their more extreme commitments. That is, they become more ready to act on behalf of the more extreme commitments. And they become more ready to engage in behavior that before belief polarization extremified their commitments, they were inclined to say would be too risky. So we become less risk averse when we come to hold more extreme commitments is part of the phenomenon. Now, I could talk about how the mechanism works and some of the experiments if you like. But for now, and by the way, just for the philosophers in the room, this is a really puzzling phenomenon. It looks like it's really bad news for any view that says that, any kind of internalist view that says our beliefs have to somehow be subject to our own efforts, our own attempts to proportion them to evidence and these sorts of things. It looks like we have less epistemic control than at least certain views of internalism about justification would require, along with other kinds of views about what good doxastic practices are in epistemology. It looks like there's some reason to think that we're just not in that kind of control that some of those conceptions of doxastic responsibility might require. I'm going to leave all that aside. I want to talk not about the puzzles about the sort of more epistemic or doxastic facing puzzles that belief polarization raises. I want to just point out that belief polarization naturally, in making us into more extreme versions of ourselves, also impacts our views about others. That is to say, belief polarization, as we shift into our more extreme selves and our more extreme commitments, we come to embrace increasingly negative attitudes towards those we perceive to be different. They don't even have to be different. We don't even have to know anything about their actual commitments. If they look like they're not part of the in-group to us, it's enough for us to start adopting more intensely negative attitudes towards them. We become more prone to dismiss what they say, to not hear what they say as reliable. We become less able to, after we hear things that they say, we become less able to accurately report what they said. We become more likely to interrupt them when they speak. We become more inclined to attribute to those who we perceive to be different from us only extreme versions of opposing views. That is, we come to see those who we perceive to be different only as extremists on the other side. Extreme views are often the most unnuanced and implausible versions of views that oppose our own. Moreover, we come to see the other side as increasingly monolithic. That is, we become less able to detect differences of opinion among our opponents. They all just look to us like they're always saying the same, one and the same thing. Moreover, we come to adopt more intensely negative affect towards them. We come to assess them as threatening, untrustworthy, dishonest, dangerous, powerful. We tend to overestimate their power. And eventually we come to feel repulsed by them. They look to us alien, and they feel to us icky, as some of the empirical results show. Now, all of that looks like it's pretty bad news for democracy, given the fact that we're supposed to show some kind of regard for our fellow citizens, despite the fact that we might politically disagree with them. Looks like belief polarization is going to distort all that. But that's not all. Belief polarization also impacts our view of our allies. It doesn't merely impact our view of the people on the other side or the people that we perceive to be our political foes. It also impacts how we view the people that we think are like us. As we shift into our more extreme selves, we become more alike our allies. That is, belief polarized groups not only shift into more extreme commitments, they also become more homogeneous across a range of behaviors, not only the behaviors that are most directly relevant to their like-mindedness. They come to talk alike, they come to dress alike, they come to wear similar hairstyles, they come to have attitudes about other things beyond their like-mindedness that start becoming more and more alike. Across the board, they become more homogeneous. But that's not all. As groups become more homogeneous in belief polarization, they also become more invested in being homogeneous. That is to say, as belief polarized groups become more alike, they also become more conformist. We might put it this way: our more extreme selves are also more conformist selves. As groups become more invested in their alikeness, more invested in being alike, they also become more increasingly intensely fixated on detecting posers and on establishing signals and signs and tests for authentic membership. This is why, as groups become more extreme, they also become more alike in that there become keywords and red hats and lapel pins and handshakes and ways of expressing words and other kinds of lifestyle choices that are designed to signal and assure other coalition members of one's authentic commitment to the group. Think for a moment, if you will, about Liz Cheney to get a sense of how this works, right? The group becomes more insistent on homogeneity and more insistent on ways in which allegiance to the group are communicated to other members. That is, belief polarization turns our alliances into tribes, things that seek lifestyle unity, not merely doctrinal unity or unity with respect to political policy beliefs. So let's fit that together now, because I think that belief polarization and political polarization interact in a way that really makes for toxicity with democracy. So I think that we can call this the polarization loop. So what I just suggested is that belief polarization creates partisan tribes. Now, I wanted to suggest that that's to be understood not in the sense that belief polarization just makes it that, we're more intensely opposed to people who we perceive to be on the other side. We are, but let's not forget, we also become more intensely invested in conformity and compliance and uniformity among our allies. That's the part that I think is often overlooked in even sophisticated discussions of the political significance of belief polarization. The tribalness or the tribal element of it has those two dimensions. So belief polarization creates partisan tribes. Widespread partisan tribalism sends a pretty clear incentive to parties and candidates and office holders and party spokespersons and party leaders to politically polarize. And what I mean there is that when you've got an electorate, a democratic citizenry that is heavily polarized, separated into two groups that are deeply invested in negative attitudes and demonizing dispositions towards the other side, but also deeply committed to in-group conformity, well, if you're running a campaign or you're seeking office, you've all of a sudden got a real easy set of strategic decisions about how to conduct yourself in your campaign. It will pay under those conditions to emphasize your animosity towards your opponent, to emphasize the respect in which, or the respects in which you find the people on the other side to be unpatriotic, untrustworthy, out to destroy the country. If you don't vote for me, you're not going to have a country anymore. Or as we saw even in Joe Biden's campaign, by the way, the last presidential campaigns had the same central campaign message. If you don't vote for me, you're going to lose your country. Or this is a battle for the soul of America, right? These are very, very wise strategic decisions given the polarized condition of the electorate. As the parties politically polarize, as they retreat to their ideological poles and expel silence, dismiss, crush any, olive branch carrying moderate. Belief polarization creates the conditions under which the electorate becomes even more, political polarization creates the conditions under which the electorate becomes more belief polarized. They become more convinced that the people on the other side are the demonized, untrustworthy, depraved, benighted destroyers, would-be destroyers of democracy that the party leaders say that they are. And that is to say, along the way, citizens lose a fundamental democratic capacity. Citizens lose the capacity to regard one another as equals, both because they lose the ability to see their political opponents as their equals, and because they become increasingly insistent on ideological uniformity and purity among their allies. That is to say, belief polarization encourages, instigates the thought that proper democracy is possible only when everyone agrees with me. That is, I don't have to say this, but I will, a profoundly anti-democratic thought. Okay. That is to say, the polarization loop is a mutually reinforcing dynamic between these two kinds of polarization, and what ultimately gets eroded are the capacities central to democratic citizenship. Good. Now, that's all pretty bleak, but I don't do optimism as a philosopher, so I'm about to say something bleaker. Despite the fact that over the past 30 years, the country, particularly over the past 30 years, the country has become more diverse in all kinds of encouraging ways. And despite the fact that even the electorate has become more diverse in all kinds of encouraging ways, the social spaces individual citizens inhabit in their day-to-day lives have become increasingly homogeneous. That is to say, despite the fact the country and the citizenry has become more diverse, the spaces you and I inhabit in our day-to-day lives have become far less diverse. In fact, they've become more homogeneous. And moreover, the dimension of their homogeneity has been fixated on partisan or political identity. In the United States today, sorry, the slide is a little screwed up. In the United States today, your consumer choices, your lifestyle, what you do on the weekends, of course, where you get your news, how much time you spend in the park that's closest to your house, how far you live from a park, how many tote bags you have, how many maps are in your home, how many clocks are in your home. We could talk about hot sauces and online dating preferences if you like, but all of these things are now so tightly tethered to your partisan identity that on the basis of a couple of basic questions about your lifestyle choices, I can very reliably predict how you vote. And what that means is not only that, partisan homogeneity and conformity has sort of spread out and saturated the whole of social space and our social behavior. It also means that the likelihood that the person standing behind you online where you buy your groceries voted for somebody different from the person you voted for is getting remarkably low. The likelihood that you'll have an unplanned encounter with somebody in your day-to-day life who's not like you in deeply relevant respects is shrinking. What that means is that your view about what your political enemies or your political opponents or your political rivals are like is increasingly coming from your political allies. And if you're familiar with, as I take it many of you are, standard worries about online social media spaces for being filter bubbles and all the rest, the political saturation of social space, the extent to which our social spaces are sorted according to our political identities, means that forget about online spaces, forget about Facebook if you can for a moment. The world around you is an echo chamber in every respect in which your social media feed is likely to be an echo chamber. Now that's all very bleak. And maybe the conclusion is that democracy is just too much for us. But I want to suggest three things that might be of some help in trying to deal with polarization. Now, the slide says managing polarization, and I think that that's one of the first things that we need to do. We need to recognize that polarization is not a problem to be fixed. Like-minded coalitions that are deeply invested in their political projects are intrinsic to democracy. You cannot eliminate them. Partisan animosity is intrinsic to democracy. It cannot be eliminated. The sense that the people on the other side of the aisle are making severe mistakes and are morally misguided is not something that can be eradicated from democracy. It's part of the package. So if polarization is undermining our democratic capacities, we can't get rid of it. We can only manage it. That's the task, trying to deal with it. Any attempt to eliminate it, I think, is going to be anti-democratic. And so the first thing I think we have to recognize is that polarization is something to be managed. It can't be solved. And I think that along with that realization has to be the realization that even though whenever I talk about polarization, people say, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And they're always thinking that polarization is the thing that their political enemies and opponents are in the grip of. I think that we have to recognize that some of our own political attitudes, some of our own political thinking is likely to be the product of these cognitive forces. That is, being right about politics doesn't make you less vulnerable to these dysfunctions because they're cognitive. So managing polarization is also acknowledging not only that it can't be eradicated, but only managed, but also acknowledging that you're also vulnerable to it in certain ways. Secondly, I think, and this is the thesis of my Overdoing Democracy book, part of the problem of polarization, part of the management task is desaturating and reclaiming elements of social space for cooperative endeavors that are non-political in nature, cooperative endeavors that are not already coded as liberal and conservative things to do, cooperative endeavors where we're engaged with others in a common activity, but not suppressing our political differences or bracketing our political differences. I'm not talking about engaging in more activities that involve reaching across the aisle. Notice the figure of reaching across the aisle still places politics at the literal center of the endeavor. I want to suggest that part of managing polarization is trying to reclaim parts of social space for activities that are cooperative, that are engaged with others, where we do not know what the political affiliation and leanings are of the other participants, not because we're suppressing or hiding them, but because it's irrelevant to what we're doing. The fact that some of you are now wondering what that could possibly be is a symptom of the problem, a confirmation of the diagnosis, not a counterexample or an objection. Lastly, distance. And this is the suggestion that comes at the end of the new book, Sustaining Democracy. So much of what counts as political thinking, so much of what counts as political action in contemporary democracy, especially in the US, comes prepackaged in the idiom of partisanship. I suggest that sometimes you need to step away, not from politics, although you might have to do that too. The suggestion here is that sometimes you need to step away from the political fray to engage in political reflection that has not come prepackaged as an accoutrement of your partisanship. That is, we need to engage in a kind of political solitude and detachment and distance where we can discover our own thinking about political ideas away from the view of both our allies and our foes alike. And I want to suggest that one way in which this can be done is by exposing yourself to political ideas and controversies and debates and perspectives that have nothing at all to do with US contemporary American democracy. Maybe this would be sitting in your room and reading the long discussion in Aristotle's Politics of the 6 or 8 or 12, depending on how you count them, conceptions of democracy. Maybe it would mean following the political news of some other country, not political reporting about our country by another country, following the political news of some other country. That is, engaging with ideas that don't speak to our political moment is a strategy for keeping our minds open to the idea that there's a lot of political thinking, even a lot of good democratic thinking that doesn't fit into the squares and circles of contemporary American democratic struggles. Political democratic thinking doesn't follow the contours and constraints of contemporary American politics. Now, if all of that sounds strange and counterintuitive, that's fine. It should. I think that's a symptom of the diagnosis. I think that's an indication that I've got the right diagnosis. I just want to ask you to ask yourself a final question. Just ask yourself what democracy's for. Now, I think it's perfectly consistent with the idea that democracy is intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable, for one to think that democracy nonetheless has a purpose. Democracy, that is, can be good in and of itself and still be aimed at achieving something, still have its value wrapped up in what it's good for. And I think that not every conception of what something is good for is merely a conception of its instrumental value. I think there are things that are good because their purposes are constitutive of their value. Now, it's real easy to read a lot of democratic theory and get the sense that democracy is for more democracy, that the purpose of democracy is more of it, the expansion of it, the perfection of it, the deepening of it. And I'm not even saying now that those kinds of views are mistaken, so much as I want to suggest that they can't be the whole story, that they have to be incomplete, because democracy has to be for something other than itself. And I want to suggest to you that what makes democracy so important is that when it's functioning relatively well, it creates social conditions under which individuals can devote large segments of their lives to the pursuit of projects and goods and worthwhile ambitions that might have nothing at all to do with democratic politics. Lives given to caring for others, nurturing others, relationships of friendship and love, support, aspirations for creativity and art, resilience, struggle, authenticity, striving for things that aren't at all elements of or ingredients of a well-functioning democratic society. That is, I want to suggest to you that part of democracy's value lies beyond democratic politics. The polarization loop undermines that thought. It tricks us into thinking that the only point of democracy is more democracy, better democracy, fuller democracy, deeper democracy. I'm all for that stuff. Just can't be the whole story. But what the polarization loop shows us is that when we start thinking that the point of democracy is democracy, and that there's no metric of value that's not itself a manifestation of the betterment and deepening of democracy, that is, when everything becomes a manifestation of our democratic aspiration, democracy is smothered and our democratic capacities are disabled. That is, when democracy becomes everything we do, we become bad at it. So for the purpose of doing democracy better, we need distance and we need to do something else sometimes. And that's the talk. Thank you.
That was great. I have to clap both virtually and really. That was terrific. Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Let's
take questions for as long as you guys can ask them.
Let's open it up. Raise your hand either in the video or not in the video, and we will go from there. Chris, go ahead.
Thanks for a terrific talk. I really enjoyed that. I like the notion, especially at the end, the very catchy thing about when democracy becomes all that we do, we become bad at it. I mean, that's very, that's a nice catchy way of summarizing your two recent books. This is pretty terrific. I want to ask a kind of techie question about the definition of political polarization that I think has ramifications for the way you think about the polarization loop. So permit me just a little bit of a digression into my understanding of the political science sort of state of the art on polarization. One of the really notable findings in political science is that actually the American public is remarkably unpolarized ideologically. That is, if you ask about specific doctrines or about specific political policies or specific things the government should do or shouldn't do, or how much tax there should be, or what we should do about climate change, or spotted newts in the distant forest, or whatever it is. I mean, there's actually the ideological or doctrinal polarization of the American public has decreased. And then the timing thing is a little tricky. Is it 30 years? Is it 40 years? Right. And it's kind of gone a little bit, but it's always been pretty low overall. And of course, you'll also know that there was a hue and cry among the political scientists, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, that there was not sufficient political polarization such that politics wouldn't work if we couldn't differentiate the two parties. Right. So it's really clear, just if we walk around everyday life, that somehow we're polarized. But when we use the notion of ideological or doctrinal polarization, it doesn't capture what's going on. So the latest sort of thinking, I mean, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, but especially the last 5 years, has been there's this other kind of polarization, which I think you touch on later in the thing, which is often called like social polarization or identity polarization or social identity polarization. Right. And the idea there is it's a very, I mean, Liliana Mason has a very simplistic psychology of this, right? You're on a team, you pick a team, and that team shops at Whole Foods or that team shops at Walmart, right? I mean, just like you said, it's the teamishness is really what's going on. So there's a polarization of teams that has nothing to do about the ideological polarization. So if I understand your account, right, you're saying we get ideological polarization in a constitutively bad positive feedback loop with the belief polarization, which is a sort of timeless, let's say, cognitive phenomenon of us being social animals, right?
Good. Yeah.
So I guess I don't see that the political polarization, the way you've defined it, gets into that loop in the right way. Because in fact, right, I mean, just to give a concrete example, right, I mean, all these political reporters had their sort of jaw on their floor when Donald Trump was the candidate for president and was saying totally un-Republican things, which then became the Republican orthodoxy, right? So how do you explain that kind of a phenomenon? Well, you explain it as it's not about ideological stuff, but it's somehow about teamishness.
Yeah.
So I guess I just want you to address that a little bit and how you understand political polarization, because I'm not sure I see the loop happening, right? There's certainly an incentive on the part of politicians to instigate team warfare, along with the sort of team purity tests that you talked about with Liz Cheney, for instance.
Right.
But that doesn't have really anything to do with ideology.
No, good. So what I want to suggest is that, so let me just tell a little bit of the longer story about my conception of political polarization. And I sort of alluded to this. I said, there are different ways of understanding what that metric of ideological distance is supposed to be. So Chris, you're right. Not only is the American electorate, not especially polarized, certainly not any more polarized than they were 40 years ago, and on a lot of what used to be, sort of the one issue voters used to vote on. It's like nobody, the American electorate has moved to the liberal side on same-sex marriage, on euthanasia, these are things no politician wants to talk about now because nobody's really invested in any deep divide about them. So actually some of the more heated stuff that the American electorate used to be divided over has kind of cooled off, and people don't argue about this stuff anymore. So all of that seems to me to be right. So I want to suggest, look, we can measure ideological distance by looking at the differences or the lack of overlap between the major parties' platforms. And, they're all, by the way, do the Republicans have a platform? They didn't, right?
The 2020 Republican platform
there was no platform.
Like, I support Donald Trump.
That was the
platform.
Right.
There was no ideology, no doctrine.
That's exactly right. So in that case, you want to say, well, that's extreme polarization because there is no overlap, right? But leaving that aside, that's one metric. And if you look at the party platforms, maybe they're not so official documents, but what their objectives are, you can get one metric, and you might get one sense of whether the parties are polarized. You can then look at instead of party documents and their platforms, you can look at the extent to which the party leadership is ideologically homogeneous. That is, you could look at the lack of ideological diversity within the party and the party leadership, and then you get a different answer to the question, right? That's the metric of ideological distance, right? If you say, well, political polarization is extreme when the leaders and the card-carrying members of the party are all unified around some particular doctrine that's characteristic of the party, so that there is no bridge to cross to the other side, and there are no sort of bridge builders. That's extreme polarization. You get a different answer to the question of whether we're polarized. The third metric, though, this sort of Shanto-Iyengar sort of has to do with rank and file citizens and their affective responses, not towards party leaders, but towards fellow citizens. And that's the link that I would want to fill in here to tell the fuller story about the loop, right? So despite the fact that among rank and file citizens, there's very little, there's far less disagreement, and there's far less of a divide among actual policies, even about economic policies, what the government should be doing. The American electorate is not really divided over these things. Despite that, what has intensified significantly and incommensurately, right, is cross-partisan animosity. And not only has it intensified, it's actually, and the Iyengar stuff shows this, right? Cross-partisan animosity has actually shifted its target. So it used to be that there was cross-partisan animosity. My father was a Republican. He liked Reagan. He hated the Democrats. He hated Jimmy Carter with a unreasonable degree of animus. He hated Jimmy Carter, right? I mean, who hates Jimmy Carter? My dad did.
It's the sweater.
Yeah, whatever it was, right? But my dad didn't hate the guy who lived across the street from us growing up, despite the fact that the guy across the street was a union member and was a straightforward, unabashed Democrat, right? Just straightforward liberal Democrat. My dad liked that guy, got along with that guy, did all kinds. That's now becoming less and less the case in American society, because affectively, animosity has skyrocketed despite it being tracking anything of substance. Now, that's the sense in which I think once you import that, that's where you start getting the loop, because we know, the political scientists tell us, right? Especially at the national level, winning an election has almost nothing to do with changing anybody's mind from, aligning with one set of ideals or one party's ideas to your ideas. Changing minds is not what democratic politics in the country is about. It's about mobilization. It's about getting the people who are already with you to give money, to show up, to vote, to canvass, to put the signs in the yard, so on and so forth. And we know that, for better or worse, we're the kinds of creatures that we are. Yeah, resentment, fear, indignation, disgust, these are real potent behavioral motivators. And so, given that the separation of social space is tied in various complex ways, Liliana Mason has got one version of this. I don't think it's entirely wrong. It just might need a lot more detail, right? One version of this where the team stuff, the mega identity stuff, becomes mega identities organized more and more around the animosity. That is, the animosity towards the other side because you find the way they live yucky is more and more central to what partisan identity is. You're right. Nothing to do with ideology or policy beliefs, just to do with the kind of ickiness that we, think about how much in this country, what passes for even popular and sometimes even sophisticated political commentary is nothing more than mocking the other side's consumption habits. The cars they drive, the clothes they wear, right? Yoga pants, camo, pickup trucks, these sorts of things. So that the affective stuff is so central means that, and here's the missing link, right? Just means that candidates have a real clear psychological motivational lever or button to push, right? When they're trying to extract political behavior from people who are their likely voters. Amplify, right, the danger of the other side winning, amplify the distrustfulness, the untrustworthiness of the other side, the depravity of the other side, because fear and indignation and resentment are the best motivational levers they have to pull. What that means is that more and more of us get our conception of our political opponents from our political allies in ways that are incentivized to highlight and exaggerate the vices of the other side, which means we spend less time finding out who they are, right? So that's how, does that help? Does that,
yeah, so that's, sorry, if I could just follow up for really quickly. Then it sounds like you have a three-part phenomena for your loop, right? Mm-hmm. You have the belief polarization, you have this social identity, affective citizenship polarization, and you have partisanship, right? So I actually think that what you're calling political polarization might drop away, and you have this sort of social identity polarization, you have political partisanship on the part of elites,
yeah,
and then you have the belief polarization, and those three seem to be working in a loop.
I agree that there needs to be a third move in there that really emphasizes the affective stuff. Now, I think it's a nomenclature, kind of discussion now. It's like, well, how many different kinds of polarization we want to bring in. I just want to say, look, the longer version of this kind of argument is just going to say, by political polarization, I'm going to mean one of these three things. I'm not going to pick sides on what's really polarization. I just want to say, well, we're talking about polarization and I'm interested in keeping it contrasted with the cognitive phenomenon. So I was like, political polarization, I just mean it's either the stuff going on about platforms, or it's the stuff going on about party members, or it's the affective stuff among rank and file affiliates. And I just want to say, look, that's all being brought into political polarization. These are just different ways of understanding what that phenomenon is all about. Just to not, by the way, you're aware of this. I'm sure other people are aware of this too. The literature on polarization, the political science literature on polarization, it's really hard to walk away from that, even, after only sort of, a good, quick look, to say these are so many of what's going on, so much of what's going on that looks like real debates among the political science guys about this is really just, they're just using the terms in different ways. If you just sort out what we're talking about, everybody gets to be right, you know. But anyway, so how's that? Is that okay? I'll accept the nomenclature stuff. It's a more complicated story than what was laid out today that would require a little bit more, you know, some finer distinctions than what I laid out. But yeah, I'm happy to accept that.
So Jenna, Clark, and then Steve. Jenna, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. Really enjoyed the talk, especially the part about calling ourselves out too, and not just our enemies. But despite the bleakness, I most enjoyed the part at the end where you gave some suggestions for what you see as possible, let's not say solutions, but ways of getting things a little less terrible. And I wanted to ask a little bit about desaturation, if that's even a word, about step 2, desaturate, connected to what you were just saying to Chris about this problem of us spending less time getting to know them. So when you were talking about what you mean by desaturate, you were saying engage in non-political cooperative endeavors with others, and you actually said like having their politics unknown to us. So like just sort of leaving the politics kind of all the way out. And I was thinking that if what we wanted from the desaturate thing was to kind of get to know people who are different from us in the relevant way, that we might need to know what their politics are. Otherwise, we kind of might make assumptions that they're like us, that they're on our team because we're seeing them do activities that we classify as good. I mean, suppose we're just like out in the community cleaning up the park together, but I just assume that because I am already in this mind space where the people on the other team aren't good people, I'm just kind of going to figure they're on my team anyway.
Right.
I mean, maybe that's not what you have in mind by desaturate, but I was trying to figure out how it could accomplish both the goal of leaving the politics out and of helping me kind of have regard for the people that I perceive as being not on my team. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Good question. So a couple things. So the purpose of the non-political cooperative endeavors is to give us a social context in which I can witness your virtues before I find out that you voted for the wrong guy, right? Where my conception of you as a responsible colleague, as a good scholar, as a, you know, as a caring parent, as a wonderful family member, as a, you know, the list can go on, that my conception of your virtues will not follow out of my understanding of you as a political ally, so that I will already see, right, Jenna as responsible and caring and supportive and, you know, dependable and so on. And then if I find out what your politics are and I'm horrified by them, I might now have more of a quandary, right? And again, it might not, I might change my mind. I'm like, well, you're not so good after all, maybe. But it just, we want to untether, insofar as we can, our idea of who the good, responsible, dependable, caring people are from our conception of who our political partisan allies and foes are. We just want to decouple those. So, so that's the sense. So that even though the ultimate aim, or the longer term aim, is to be able to regard my political opponents as nonetheless my equals and entitled to an equal say and all the rest, I don't think you can start there. You know, a lot of we've got some experimental results that show something very, very depressing, right? You give some people even a little bit of money to follow a moderate social media feed from somebody purporting to be on the other side. So the moderate version of the conservative for the liberal subject, or the liberal for the conservative subject. Pay them a little bit of money just to add them to their social media feed. And it's very likely that even the moderate expression amplifies the polarization. That the moderate, once we're polarized, so let me put it this way, different way to put it. What would be a good strategy for preventing this from happening to us is not a good guide to what we should do now that it's happened, right? So even though the aim is to repair political relations among partisan adversaries, I don't think we can start there. I think the first step in repairing those relations has to be decoupling in the popular, citizen, in the mind of the citizen, decoupling good, dependable, reliable, virtuous person from the idea of a partisan ally, and decoupling vicious, depraved, evil, untrustworthy, dishonest person from the idea of a partisan adversary. So that's what the non-political stuff is aiming to do. Last point on this. And again, that, I've given lots of talks where I say this thing. You haven't put it this way. I'm not saying that you're thinking this thought. But one of the things that people often say is, as I said in the talk, what in the world could you possibly be talking about? Right? What could you be talking? Non-political, it's non-political but cooperative with other people? Right? What do you mean? Right? And I gave this sort of backhand response, like that's a symptom, that's a confirmation of the diagnosis, not the challenge that you think it is. But what I say in the Overdoing Democracy book is that political saturation has reached such a point in the country that, yeah, you can't go find these activities. You've got to reclaim parts of social space for them. Now, I'll just give one very quick example. You can probably tell from the sound of my voice that I'm not originally from Tennessee. When my wife and I moved to Nashville 20 years ago from New Jersey, we had all kinds of views about what moving to the South would be like. It turns out that most of them are, just Northeast parochialism and, completely false and all the rest. I've had the best Ethiopian food of my life in Nashville, Tennessee, for example. Anyway, one thing that I started doing as I started working through some of these ideas is I started going to an open mic night at a bluegrass bar. I don't know anything. I'm a amateur, not even an amateur. I know how to play an instrument, right? Don't really care about bluegrass music, but somebody told me this is an open mic night that is top notch. You want to see like world-class bluegrass music, this is the place to go. And it's a little dive hole in the wall. You're sitting at picnic benches, you can buy a popcorn and beer. I mean, it's that kind of place. And I have all kinds of good reason, inductive reason, to believe that the guy sitting at the picnic across from me on Sunday night at the picnic bench doesn't share my political ideas. I've got good reason to think that that person is far to my right. I have good reason to think that even the ones who are not conservative, if there are any, they're probably not as far to the left as I take myself to be, right? So I've got all kinds of inductive reason to think that these are political others, right? But sitting around that series of picnic benches over popcorn and listening to these guys tell me about the songwriter and the mandolin player and how the guy who's playing the upright bass was the son or the cousin of the person who played on Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire. I mean, hearing this stuff, like I just walk away with the idea like these people have very sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities with respect to this particular genre of music that is so beyond what I'm able to compute, even as a competent player of guitar. Like I'm just not able to compute all this stuff with this kind of music. These people have really well-developed aesthetic senses, real knowledge of the tradition, a real deep understanding of the songs and how they were written and when they were written and what they're about that are just beyond me. And it's just like, it might be a trifling thing. It's like, I just can't see them, despite the fact that the political philosopher in me knows that I would be horrified to hear them talk about politics. It's just really hard for me to see them as completely depraved human beings. And that's all I'm saying. Like that might be, not deeply significant. That's not going to fix the world for democracy, but it's something, and it might be the best that we can try for these days, is just find little episodes in life where I don't know what your political leanings are, but we've interacted in ways so that now it's going to be harder for me if I find out that you're one of the bad guys politically. It's just going to be harder for me to think that your politics make you a completely depraved, befallen, terrible, failed human being. That's all I got on that. How's that?
No, I mean, I think I just mostly totally agree with you, but I think I would push a little bit. What you've described in the bluegrass phenomenal example is really not just an interaction. It's more like a development of a relationship. And so there's actually a little bit of even the broadening of the people that you see in your life. And so I think that may be just sort of worth paying attention to. Like a one-off activity might not do it. And so you said interaction, I think I read activity, but I think what you actually mean is like getting to know someone. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah, that might be right. And the Danielle Allen, by the way, you're hopefully future governor. Danielle Allen's one of the early books, Talking to Strangers, I think has got a lot of lessons that I don't think were fully enough heated in the country about. I just don't want to push too heavily on that, because I don't want to say you've got to go and invite invite the people that you see as actively working against your civil rights over to coffee, right? It can't be that thick a commitment, right? So I want to say, even if it's just a one-off thing, there's still potential to just say, well, that was a decent guy. Oh, but he voted for Trump. Well, okay, maybe he's just got really bad political judgment. I don't know. That it's just going to be harder for me to see him with horns and a tail now. I mean, that's it's pretty thin in that way. And again, I don't do optimism, so I'm just saying, I don't know if this is democracy could be in much worse shape, because a lot of this might be irretrievable. This is just a suggestion that this is probably better than doing nothing. Well, this is better than doing nothing, and might be a good supplement to things that we are doing that look like they're promising, like deliberative polling and citizen juries and facilitated democratic discussions and all that. I'm on board with all that. Just want to say, until there's a decoupling of, right, till there's a way to see one another as something more than our political alliances, all of those very promising interventions in sort of building the democratic ethos are going to be incomplete.
Clark and then Steve. Let's try to get two more in.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Jenna, for that awesome question, because anyway, it was an awesome question, and I appreciate the answer to it. You remind me that I think there are some trends in society where these opportunities for those kinds of relationship building interactions have started to disappear, largely, I think, maybe because of what my colleague would call time poverty. So things like bowling leagues and social events of various types seem to be a lot less prevalent. One comment, one question. A comment goes back to Chris's question, actually, which is, I heard a talk from David Brady, who's a political scientist at Stanford, talking about the elections, and he was talking about the sorting of ideologies that has taken place in the Republican and Democratic parties over the last, I don't remember his time period, but I want to say 30 or 40 years. So it may very well be that if you look at the standard deviation of political ideology, it's smaller than it used to be, just as you say, that we are closer to believing the same things as we ever were. But I would argue, based on what David Brady was saying, is that the distribution has become decidedly more bimodal than ever. So we might not be as far apart, but we are so around the means of the small split that it feels like a giant split, and there really is much less overlap in that area. So that I think plays into the political ideology thing you were talking about before, that would make what seems like a coming together feel much more separate. My question is, you made the point in the beginning of the talk that democracy creates some obligations on us to participate, right? And at the same time, at the end, you talked about how democracy must be for something other than just more democracy, and made the point that one of the things it allows us to do when it functions well is devote time and resources to all sorts of other goods that we can benefit from. But there's a little bit of a tension there. I mean, one could argue that if democracy demands of us our time for the system to work at all, and if we were to compare it to perhaps a benevolent dictatorship, not that necessarily one could easily exist, in that benevolent dictatorship, you would have arguably a lot more time. You wouldn't have to worry about what's happening in politics. It'd be taken care of by somebody else, and you could devote more of the time to those goods. So is it, could you speak to that tension a bit, or am I just sort of off base?
Sure. No, again, the argument about the desaturation stuff, and in fact, both of the books are explicitly committed to a pretty robust deliberativist conception of democratic legitimacy, democratic practice, and the obligations of citizens. So my argument is simply that, the upshot is not, do less politics, or it's all small stuff, don't sweat the small stuff. There's something else that has to be done in addition to the responsibilities of democratic citizenship, not as a replacement, but something in addition. So no matter how robust a conception of civic duty you might have, right? And I've got a pretty robust one, right? I think, yeah, we are required to be participants, not merely voters, right? We're required to, to be actual, to do what we can to fulfill the role of part author of our shared political world. And that means that we've got pretty stringent, it seems to me, moral duties to others as citizens, and duties to show them a certain kind of regard and to consult with them and to try to see things from their perspective. So I've got a pretty, heavy duty deliberativist conception of our political, of our political obligations. The argument is just that, well, there's another thing. In order to develop and preserve the capacities that will enable you to discharge those civic obligations properly, you have to do sometimes you have to do something that's not politics with other people. Sometimes. Now, I think you're right that when you add a new kind of demand, or just even you just add to the demands of democratic citizenship, you're facing the problem that, well, under non-ideal conditions, let's just put it that way, right? Under existing conditions, democratic citizenship, proper democratic citizenship, effective or authentic democratic citizenship is getting further and further out of reach of people who don't enjoy certain kinds of privilege. So that one might say, like the person who you mentioned at the beginning of your comment about sort of time deficits and time being deprived of time, Elizabeth Cohen stuff, right? You say, I want to say, look, that's part of the story of societies failing at democracy, not merely because, right? That they don't have, that they're so pressed for time means they can't be informed, they can't do democratic things, but also because it robs them of the part of the social goods that democracy's part of the social goods whose production is part of democracy's value, right? And that is a social order that creates conditions under which we sometimes can produce things, can engage in activities that don't have politics as their aim. Now, so I'm wanting to say then that devoting your life to non-political goods is consistent with meeting your obligations as a democratic citizen. How's that? I mean, I just would want to just say that, right? Like, yeah, I mean, the problem to be addressed is the idea that everything is politics. If everything is politics, democracy suffers. That's the thought. How's that?
I'll take it.
Okay.
I mean, it almost sounds like there, I wouldn't necessarily call it the result of democracy or intrinsic to democracy, but almost an exogeneity that must exist for democracy to succeed. And for that exogeneity, this things that you do that are not democracy, that are sort of required for democracy to thrive, also are often, let's just say, correlated with all sorts of other social goods. And it is only when that takes place that the entire system really works.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Steve.
Thanks, Bob. That was terrific. Quick question, which leads out into a big issue, but we don't have to go into all the ins and outs. I'm wondering if there needs to be, and maybe I haven't read your most recent book, and so maybe it's there.
It's okay. It's only 2 weeks old. You
Okay.
got time.
Whether we need an institutional account here with respect, at least, to polarization in our context. So if you think of something like, just for instance, but we could talk about many features of our constitutional order, but if you think about the filibuster, for example, right, there's a good argument to be made that that massively increases polarization because parties don't have to take responsibility because they know they're not going to pass things, so that they can then appeal to the effective lives of their voters in the way that you were eloquently talking about, without having the threat of, oh crap, this something might pass and I might have to run on something that's not popular by opposing it, and so on and so forth. And I think we could go through a whole range of institutional features of our order which contribute to that. And so I'm wondering how that would play into the sort of social psychological account you're giving, how these two levels would interact.
So, the comparative stuff here is really, really interesting. And I'll go so far as to say this. Certain institutional forms that are present in our democracy, filibuster might be one of them, but just the fact that it's non-parliamentary might be another, seem to play a role in determining where polarization shows up, the channels by which it's manifest. And I would say there's some reason to think that those institutional forms play some role in how severe it is. But comparatively speaking, there's not an institutional fix to the problem. There are different kinds of constitutional orders see these kinds of dysfunctions showing up in different kinds of places, maybe with marginal, sometimes not marginal, but not really super duper significant, right? Differences in severity. And that might be non-surprising because what's sort of at the heart of the incentivizing the parties to pull apart and demonize one another is something that looks like it's much more hardwired, cognitive, part of our, as Chris was saying, part of our makeup as the kinds of sort of social creatures that we are. You could just fit it into the Aristotelian accounts, like bees are social in this way, humans are social in that way, right? The ways that humans are social, in part, we're really into, fitting in with the people that we see as people who are relevantly like us, or we're really into fitting in with people, even when there's no basis for seeing ourselves as alike the people that we're with. We invent reasons to see ourselves as like them, right? The sort of robber's cave kinds of examples and things. We make reasons, we make features of people significant when we want that make them like us, when we want to feel feel at home with them. So that it's a cognitive phenomenon that drives or is at the core of this, at least on my account, would predict, and it looks like some of the comparative work shows, it's to use a Greek expression, it's etsy-getsy, it's a little of this and a little of that. You can see institutional forms determining where the polarization dysfunctions show up and to some degree how severe they will get. But we don't have institutional forms that eliminate this. They just, change the channels by which the phenomena show up and in some ways moderate the impact on the system. but having said that, I will say, yeah, there are all kinds of institutional changes in the United States that I think would address some of the worst features of the polarization dynamic that now dominates. It might just shift channels and disperse the badness of the effect in particular ways that make for an overall benefit. But yeah, so I would agree with all that, you know, especially non-parliamentary. You know, there are problems with parliamentary systems too. When you've got basically a two-party system, it just creates a certain ways of these dysfunctions manifesting themselves that are particularly destructive and hard to mitigate. Does that make sense?
Bob, thank you so much. That was
Thanks
really
everyone for making time. It was really nice to talk to you all. Thanks for your attention.
really appreciate it.
If anybody, by the way, if anybody is interested in the book, I will leave with Steve. I've got a flyer from Oxford for the new book that has a discount code on it. So if you're interested in the book, want to buy the book, you can get one of these flyers from Steve. I hope that's okay with you, Steve. And you can buy it at I think it's a 30% discount, which, you know, it's a $25 book. So yeah, so that's almost a cheap book. But anyway, I'll leave that with you, Steve, in your office. How's that? Good?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.